Hello, I'm Mike Higton. I'm the academic lead on the Common Awards Partnership from the Durham University side, and it's a delight to welcome you today to this webinar. We try to put on webinars regularly over the year, just sort of covering topics of interest that are supplements to the normal curriculum that you're covering in your institutions. I should say that we are recording this webinar and that a video and an audio will go up online later. That will just be of the presentations. We don't these days put up the video of the Q&A session later on, so you don't need to worry if you're asking a question later that you'll be immortalized. It's just the presentations themselves that we'll put up online later. Can I ask you, while we've got the presentations going, not to use chat until we've got through that, because it can be quite distracting if chat's sort of buzzing during the presentations themselves, but feel free to use it once the presentations have finished. Can I also ask you if you could, as well as staying muted during the presentations, if you could turn your video feeds off, because I'm told that for people on low bandwidth connections, it can help if there are fewer video feeds being processed, even if they're not all on screen. So if you can switch your videos to off as well, if you know how to do that. I think that's it for practical arrangements. I'll explain when we've got through the presentations how we're going to run the Q&A session. I'll explain that when we get there. But as I say, thank you for joining us today. It's good to see you all. Good to have a good number here. I'm very much looking forward to today's session, and now it's my delight to introduce our two speakers. So we have Rabbi Debbie Young-Summers from Edgware and Hendon Reform Synagogue, also lectures at Leo Beck College on religion and dialogue, speaks and writes in that area and on liturgy and on many other topics. And you might have heard her on Radio 2's Pause for Thought from time to time. And she also knows the Common Awards world, having contributed to interfaith teaching in various theological education institutions. So will be familiar to some of you, perhaps. And then we've got Jon Morgan, who is an Associate Research Fellow and member of the Centre for Biblical Studies at the University of Exeter. He's previously held posts in Hebrew Bible at Exeter, Biblical Interpretation at Chester, and ran the Centre for Theology, Imagination and Culture at Sarum College, and has research interests focused on the use of the Bible in contemporary politics and popular culture. And I'm delighted to have the two of you here today, really looking forward to hearing what you're going to say. And today the topic is, should Christians celebrate Passover? And I think we're going to be beginning with Jon. So if you'll just give me a couple of seconds, I'll switch the spotlighting round, and then it will be over to you. So Jon, we're in your hands.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you, first of all, just to say thank you, especially to Mike for putting this session together, something I think is really interesting and important topic for us to talk about, and also thank you for the invitation to contribute. Hi everyone, good afternoon. I'm going to share my screen, have a presentation. There we go. Hopefully you can now see that presentation. And you'll notice from the title I've chosen there that what I'm not going to be offering today is a kind of balanced evaluation of the idea of Christian Seders. I'm not going to be saying, here's some reasons why they might be a good idea, here's some reasons why they might be not such a good idea. Right from the outset, I've put my cards on the table in terms of saying that I think they are a really terrible idea. So that's going to be the tenor of my presentation. I think in beginning it's probably a good idea to outline the idea of a Christian Seder, just so we're clear about what we're talking about. And indeed about how the phenomenon of Christian Seders kind of relates to the wider idea about Christians celebrating Passover, which is perhaps something, a little connection that we need to make. So Christian Seder meals are a very specific kind of Christian celebration. or Christian interaction with Passover, and they are they're quite a popular phenomenon. They've been around for a relatively long time, but their popularity has kind of waned and grown. My sense is that at the moment they are in a more popular phase, which from my point of view is a shame. So what is a Christian Seder? Christian Seder is an event that's organized by a Christian group, where those who come together either share a Seder meal, or there's a kind of walkthrough instruction around what a Seder meal is. But where the meal that's shared, or the topic that's discussed, is Christianized. So the classic elements of the Seder meal are reinterpreted in line with Christian ideas. That often means doing specific pieces of reinterpretation with the kind of classic symbols of the Seder plate, for example, rethinking what the lamb bone, or the egg, or the afikomen, or whatever it is, what those elements mean in a Christian context. They're most popular in what we might call low or non-liturgical Protestant contexts. I think there are sociological reasons why that is likely to be the case. However, they are, I think, now fairly commonly also found in Lutheran contexts, in Roman Catholic contexts, and indeed in Anglican contexts. I think Debbie is going to talk later to one particular instance of Anglican interaction with the idea of a Christian Seder. So I'm going to try and offer you an argument about why these are a terrible idea. And basically I have 3 points to make, which I'm going to make relatively quickly. And then I'm going to hand over to Debbie. And then we are going to try and give the majority of our time together this afternoon to your questions. So that's roughly how we're going to work it. But here's my argument about why Christian Seders shouldn't happen. So I have 3 points. The first of which is that they are, to a large extent, I think, based on a pretty significant historical misconception, and they also invite or incorporate pretty bad theology. I think one of the key rationales that's often given for engaging in this practice is one of kind of reconnection to Jewish roots. This is something you hear a lot. The idea of kind of reclaiming, reconnecting with something that is early in Christian practice, and indeed specifically with the Passover meal, engaging with something that was practiced by Jesus and by his disciples. I've heard people say, for example, in trying to defend the idea of a Christian Seder, that, you know, what was the Last Supper if it wasn't a kind of Christian Seder? I think this is, as I say, based on a pretty fundamental historical misconception. It's not clear at all, for example, whether the supper in the upper room that's recounted in the New Testament was actually a Passover meal. That's a bone of contention amongst New Testament scholars. But even if it was, the key point is that it would not have involved the standard elements of a Passover Seder as they're celebrated today. Those traditions belong to a later era. The earliest Haggadot, the texts that set out the ordering of the Passover Seder, they likely date from the 4th century. Even then, that's not the kind of that's not necessarily the final form, but that's probably the earliest. So this is a very squarely rabbinic phenomenon. It is not a phenomenon that would have been around in the first century, and is therefore not something that Jesus and his disciples would have practiced. And of course, over the many centuries since the first versions of the Haggadot, many versions and variations of practice have come about. I think one thing we can say, and it's important to say, is that however Jesus and his disciples did observe Passover, whether they were sharing it together in the upper room, whether they had Passover meals, individually with their families and so on, however they observed Passover, they did so as Jews. Christians already have a rite that reinterprets Exodus imagery, draws on traditional Jewish forms to some extent, and that is communion, the rite that Jesus taught his disciples to practice. So there's, I think, a fairly basic question about why, given the historical reality of this, why Christians would actually want to engage. There's also then, my second point is about essentially how harmful it is when Christians do engage. I would want to describe it as highly insensitive neighboring. Obviously, Jews themselves disagree about how offensive they might personally find the practice of Christian Seders. But I think we can say very clearly that generally co-opting another group's religious practice, imprinting upon it your own beliefs, correcting it with your own ideas, and then performing it, I've said here as a kind of pastiche. Often the word that gets used is that it strikes people as a kind of cosplay. That kind of, going through that kind of process is, at the very best, the best thing we could say about that is that it's rude and insensitive. I think it's not a good way of showing sensitivity, showing care, showing respect to neighbours. This image here of a Christian Seder plate is, I think, illustrative in a couple of ways. Those of you who read any Hebrew might well struggle to make sense of this. Essentially, what's happened is that someone who doesn't know any Hebrew has produced this, and they've mistyped the characters such that we've ended up with gibberish words. They've tried to recreate the Hebrew words here for Pesach and Zeruah, but they have misunderstood which characters are which and have ended up putting in nonsense letters that presumably looked the same to them. I think that's illustrative again of this sense of kind of a role playing that can actually be very insensitive in the way it's done. There's a kind of fetishization which can come in here, and often one that is ultimately does not look like it's taking things that are sacred and important to others with kind of the requisite seriousness. The Passover Seder is a uniquely Jewish retelling of uniquely Jewish experience. So there really isn't a way for Christians to center themselves in that that's not fundamentally disrespectful. And that's even before we think about questions of power around the different kinds of power relationships that Christians and Jews have had access to. And then my third point, my third argument, kind of draws together aspects of those first two and combines them. And it's my accusation here, my claim, that this practice is fundamentally unreflexive. It misses out reflection on things that should be very important, and it's anti-solidarity. What do I mean by that? Well, I think to engage in a practice like this involves the disregarding, to some extent, of the very particular and pervasive history of Christian anti-Semitism. It ignores the roles that replacement theology, supersessionist theology, and specific instances of Christians lying or misrepresenting Jewish ritual practices. It disregards the role that those things have played in violence against Jews. So there's a very particular reason why Jews may well be feel very uneasy about Christians re-representing their ritual practices, because Christians have misrepresented Jewish ritual practices in key ways that have fed into violence against Jews over history. And to engage in this, I think, simply misses the need to reflect on that history. Of course, the Passover story is about liberation from slavery in Egypt, but of course, in Jewish practice, there's often an extension, an allegorical extension, to thinking about other times, other examples of historical persecution of communities and families and so on. And Christians, I think it's absolutely incumbent upon Christians not to ignore the fact that many of those other instances of persecution, of violence that Jews remember at Passover have been the direct result of Christian teaching, Christian practice. And I think this very important point, that the fact that Easter and Passover obviously share the same calendrical space, I think it's absolutely essential for Christians to remember that Easter has been a time of terror for many Jews down through the centuries, because Easter was a time when Christians were taught and encouraged in various periods to go out and to find Jews and to do harm to them. So when Christians come along and try and engage in this, to take on this practice and to Christianize it, there's something much more serious there than just a kind of rudeness. There's also, I think, a kind of a very significant derogation of duty to remember these particular kinds of historical instances where Christians really should be thinking about their own role in violence and persecution against Jews. The historical mistake that I mentioned in my first point, that Christians engaging in Seders would be connecting with some history that belongs to the origins of Christianity. I think this is part of a wider idea, a wider mistake that a lot of Christians have, which is this idea that Jews and Judaism have basically been the same forever. So this is a kind of the Judaism today is just an extension of what predated Christianity. And that idea can itself feed into a very pervasive and very problematic anti-Semitic idea, this idea that Jews are kind of outside of time because they're this kind of historical people that are still doing the same thing that they've always done since the time of Moses or whatever. And that idea of Jews being out of time is also very much connected with the idea that Jews are kind of outside of place as well. So it contributes to the very significant anti-Semitic idea that there's no place for Jews to belong in the modern world. And obviously that is not something that I think Christians should be garnering. I think very obviously the idea of people whose beliefs, whose traditions and practices are stuck in the past, who, you know, it's possible to visit them on a holiday by going back to the past and then coming back to the present to do something else. Those kinds of people, if that's the way we're conceiving of people, then those people, it's easy to undermine the the rights and the place of those people in the present moment. This is I think, a very problematic and persistent idea that really we need to correct, that Christian communities need to correct this understanding. And I think distancing ourselves from practices like borrowing or engaging in kind of cosplay with Jewish rituals is very much not doing. But there's also a sense in which we live in a moment where, sadly, anti-Semitism, hard right populism, ethno-nationalism, I've put here opposition to anti-fascism, all those things are recorded as being on the up by various markers in the UK and also globally. That's a very serious situation. And the churches need to be very committed to resisting those things and to signalling to Jewish neighbours that they're doing so. I think the Jews in our communities, in our neighbourhoods, need to know that we have their backs. And my sense is that churches hosting Seders, engaging in this practice of taking up this Jewish ritual, reinterpreting it, using it for Christian ends, that's doing very much the opposite of sending out this message of solidarity and that people are aware that these things are on the rise and that are very significant dangers to Jews. So those are my three significant concerns, problems with the practice of Christian Seders. It's based on a historic mistake and it incorporates some bad theology. It's rude and it's unneighborly, to say the very least. And it shows a lack of reflection on things that are really serious and a lack of commitment to standing by our Jewish neighbours in contexts where they may feel threatened. So I think that's why it's a really terrible idea. Thank you for listening to that. That's my contribution as an opening starting point. I'll hand over to Debbie. She has something to share, and then we will hear from you in the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Jon. So, I mean, what I'm going to do will, in a way, reinforce everything Jon has just said, and perhaps tell it from a Jewish angle, as it were, and to do what we do, which is teach from the text, but also to speak of my own sort of experience in living through these sorts of things. I actually get asked fairly regularly by non-Jewish groups, usually Christian groups, to come and lead a Seder for them. And I always have three questions, maybe to mirror your three models, Jon, that I try to unpack with whoever it is on the phone to understand if this is something that I can do. So the first thing I try to understand is if they want to hold a Seder in order to worship Jesus. Unfortunately, I can't help with that. It's not my bag. It's not what I'm trained to do. It's not what I know how to do. And obviously, it's not my belief system. So just as I wouldn't come and try to lead Mass, I also wouldn't try to lead a Seder that in some way tries to worship Jesus. And I have to say, I had quite a visceral response seeing that image of the Seder plate that Jon shared. I've not seen that one before. And the idea of, you know, the zeroah, the lamb bone, or we often use a chicken bone, literally writing on the Seder plate, never mind the terrible Hebrew mistakes, but, you know, this is the Lamb of God, that, you know, Jesus as the Lamb of God is not a theology that I can sit with. It's just not where Jews are. So to put on a Passover plate that's a very rabbinic innovation, as you heard and as we're going to see, to take the symbols that we've crafted over thousands of years to create a meaningful Seder and to say, well, you know, this is the Lamb of God. It's very supersessionist, really, and quite painful to see. Not that there is anything wrong with holding a Christian theological position, but to do that through Jewish rites becomes very painful. So I'm not going to run a Seder that helps anybody to worship Christ, because that's not my job. It's not what I believe, and it's not what I can do. It's what you can do. You can help lead people through worship of Jesus. Perhaps people want to have a Seder in their church or in their local community centre because they want to understand their Jewish neighbours. And that is something I'm very happy to help with. I've run lots of what we call mock Sederim. So we basically put together our Seder plate and we put the symbols out, and we'll bring some Haggadot. I grabbed 4 off my shelf this afternoon, but I've got loads at home, loads here, all different. Even Sammy Spider, who's a kid's character that we have lots of books about, has a Haggadah for himself. So I would with pleasure come and teach about what Jews do at Passover so that people can understand. But actually the most common thing I have found that these calls come from is that people want me to come and lead a Seder so that they can understand what Jesus would have done. And as Jon has already quite clearly explained, it is absolutely pointless asking a 21st century Jew to come and help you understand what Jesus would have done. What we do today, of course, shares roots with what Jesus might have done at Passover, but is an absolutely different kind of a practice. So I thought what we might do is begin with a look at what the biblical texts tell us needs to happen, because these, I'm assuming, Jesus would have been familiar with. So we've got 2 main places where we derive the Seder or the Passover rituals, from. We have Exodus 12, which is in the midst of the Exodus narrative. And then we also have the repetition, as with so many other things biblically, in Deuteronomy, where the Deuteronomic historian is going to retell it in their own little way. But the laws that we extract from Deuteronomy and Exodus in terms of what we must have at Passover are that we observe a feast of unleavened bread. So we have our matzah. This is a box from last year that has just gone out of date, so I'm trying to finish them off because we're going to need the new lot for a few weeks' time. And I did read something today about somebody saying at their Messianic Seder, the holes in the matzah were meant to represent the holes in Jesus' body. No, I've made matzah with my husband. We put holes in it because it makes sure that it cooks quickly and thoroughly and that there's nothing uncooked, because if you have uncooked matzah, it can become leavened and therefore it is unkosher. So we need our unleavened bread. That's a core part of the observance of Passover. We're given the date of when it happens, the 14th day of the month of Aviv. We eat unleavened bread until the 21st day. No leaven should be found in your houses for 7 days. So we go crazy between Purim, which is next week, and Passover. We've got about 4-week period where Jews will be busily cleaning out their houses. Funnily enough, I know many of you are now in Lent. We've just had Pancake Day. You will have been perhaps having a symbolic cleanse. I tend to troll a lot of my friends who post photos of their pancake supper, asking them what they're giving up for Lent, just to remind people that these things have meaning and roots and origins, and just cooking pancakes one day of the year is not actually what it's about. So similarly, we have a whole process that we go through before Passover, cleansing our homes, spring cleaning, getting rid of all this leaven. We'll clean out under all the beds, under all the couch pillows. It's very cathartic. I can highly recommend it. But really, no one should eat or own leaven. And you're cut off from the community if you do. You eat nothing that is leavened in all of your settlements, only unleavened food. And then Moses says, go pick out lambs for your families and slaughter the Passover offering. And of course, it was this Passover offering that Jewish practice focused on during the time of the temple. The Paschal lamb was really the core of the Passover rite. I didn't put it all in here, but there's huge amounts of detail of how one sacrifices the lamb, how it was one lamb per family. The whole thing needed to be eaten by the entire family. If anything was left over by the morning, it has to be burnt. Great detail. And in fact, today, many Jewish communities have the tradition of avoiding anything close to roast lamb because we don't want to be seen to imitate the practice of the temple. We are not Jews living in temple times. We cannot recreate the rites of the temple. Everything that exists as Passover now is what has developed in response to the loss of the temple and in response to the loss of the ability to offer the Passover sacrifice. So the Seder is born out of this gap. The temple is destroyed. We can't take a Passover offering. So the Seder develops as a Greco-Roman, sort of modeled on the Greco-Roman symposium to try and create a meaningful service. And actually, I often argue that Rabbinic Judaism, which is what we live today, in many ways is a sort of generational questioning in every age of how do we make this meaningful today, now that there is no temple. All of our major festivals certainly were rooted in temple practice, whether it's, the 3 pilgrim festivals, Shavuot, Sukkot, Pesach, the High Holy Days. So much of the ritual was rooted biblically in the offerings and what one would do in the temple. So we have spent 2,000 years developing new practices, new meaning, and celebrating what it means to innovate, really, so that these things will be meaningful for us without the temple. So this actually was probably the core of what was going on. If the Last Supper was a Passover meal, this might be what it consisted of. The 3 things that we read as part of the Haggadah, as part of the Seder, that you have to have at Passover or you haven't done the job. You eat the flesh of the lamb that night, which we now replace with something called haroset, which is a sweet brown sticky substance, with your unleavened bread and with bitter herbs. So we make a matzah sandwich with bitter herbs and with our haroset, this sort of brown sticky stuff. But we have to mention Pesach, the Passover lamb, matzah, maror, the bitter herbs, these 3 elements that were essential. If you're Ashkenazi or European Jew, these hard, crunchy matzahs are what would be eaten. My husband's tradition is actually an Iraqi Middle Eastern tradition, so we make our own matzahs that are soft. And I like to imagine that this meal might have been a little bit like a shawarma. So you've got your, or a kebab, you've got your roast lamb, a nice chutney with a bit of bitterness, all wrapped up in a nice soft laffa bread that's unleavened. Must have been absolutely delicious. But of course, we don't have the Paschal lamb to take that role anymore. And we don't have a Paschal sacrifice being the focus of what goes on, although the Samaritans do have a fascinating continuation of that practice in Israel today, which one can go and witness and see. It's an amazing thing, but not a Jewish thing. So, oh no, hang on, I'm gonna get rid of this momentarily, stop share. You'd think I'd know how to do this after 3 years. So there is something, as Jon was saying, it's really important to understand that what has developed over the last 2,000 years is really about telling the story of the Exodus and making it meaningful to our children and to us today. A lot of the elements of what we call Seder today are found in what we call the Mishnah, which was compiled around 210 CE. And was actually written down in part with the motivation that the redactors wanted to make sure we knew what the custom of the temple was, so when it was rebuilt we would know what to do, but also to record what was done now because we had no temple. And the continuation of the Mishnah, the commentary on the Mishnah, is the Talmud, a term you might be more familiar with, from around the 500s to 800s. Huge amounts of discussion as to what it looks like. But even then, it's not exactly what we have today. It's a holiday meal that has evolved over thousands of years. And as I said before, Haggadot, the books, continue to be produced in every generation with new angles, new commentaries, new ways of looking at it. And this is really a continual Jewish process of working out how in every generation we make these things meaningful. So it's based on this Greco-Roman model of a symposium, which involved things like a banquet framed by specific appetizers, eating in a reclining position, drinking a certain amount of predetermined cups of wine, songs of praise, questions, and the questions aren't always answered, excuse my phone, some philosophical engagement that would have gone late into the night. And it's really the cornerstone for many families today of coming together, of celebrating a core moment in the year. There'll be many families who keep nothing else through the year, but will come together for Passover to mark that particular festival and to share the foods and to be together. It must have been about 2 years ago, I think, that our Anglican friends created a ritual for the home for Easter, a service for the home. And I wasn't actually aware of this having been done until I started to see lots of clergy friends on Twitter basically saying, "Oh, please don't use this." And I thought, "Oh, what's gone on? Why mustn't people use it?" And people were using words like cultural appropriation, it's not okay. So I clicked on the link to see what there was. And this was a home kitchen ceremony centered around the family dinner table with a plate of symbols, at which the youngest child begins by asking, "Why is this night different to all other nights?" Which is straight out of the Haggadah. This is not what would have happened at the Last Supper. This is a rabbinic innovation that really needs to, lead to a sense of how do we continue to pass this from generation to generation as a Jewish community. So it was quite bizarre to see that liturgy reappearing in an Anglican context, and speaking from my own experience, it does feel a little bit like cultural appropriation, because it's not rooted in what Jesus would have done. It's rooted in what developed after the destruction of the temple. Now, one could say, what's the harm? It's not hurting anyone. It's a nice way of sharing traditions and acknowledging that we do have a common root, and there is, of course, a common root. Many argue that we're not, in fact, some people say Judaism is the mother, and to understand our roots, we have to understand Jewish practice. Christianity is the child. But actually, I would personally argue that we are more like sibling faiths, which are both born out of the destruction of the temple. And of course, there's crossover, but in our unique paths as distinct children, we've developed unique ways of finding meaning in our practices and in our rites. And as Jon said, our complicated history makes the co-opting of Seder rituals even more painful. Now, I'm sure most of you will know that academically, it's basically argued that blood libels originate in England. We can be proud that we started the blood libels here. The blood libel is the idea that claims were made against Jews, suggesting that they were sacrificing Christian children in order to take their blood to make matzah. Now, of course, Jews don't eat blood of a lamb or a cow, let alone human blood. Absolutely abhorrent, not a thing that happens. It's a blood libel. It's a lie to create fear and anti-Semitism. But don't think that this is just ancient church history. I grew up in South Hertfordshire in the 1980s, and my local community, at least 2 years, I seem to remember, it may well have been more, letters would be distributed through doors, warning local residents not to allow their children to play out on the street before Passover, because Jews would be looking out for children to nab and to sacrifice and to bleed. You know, I'm a Jewish child growing up in a little English village where people are being warned that we want to kill their children. This is not ancient history. This is what still happens, or certainly was happening 30 years ago. It's in my life. So these things have real repercussion and real pain for the Jewish community. So yes, there is a shared heritage, but sometimes that shared heritage in and of itself causes us to balk at the sharing of rituals and practices. So just as a kind of last sort of reflection, I recently wrote an article for the London Jewish News, or it's called the Jewish News now, sorry, sort of jokingly reflecting on whether we should be observing anything to do with Valentine's, and looking at the Christian roots of Valentine's Day. And actually, I was basically arguing that you should show love to your partner every day of the year and not just focus it on 1 or 2 days. We do also have a Jewish version of a day of celebrating love. But my argument was, you know, show each other love every day, not just once a year. But we received, one of the things I said in that article was, imagine how it would feel if Christians were lighting the Hanukkah or celebrating Seders, because Jews generally don't love this idea. And I was quite amused that the Jewish News received a letter in response to my article, which they forwarded on to us, which says, I read with interest your article about Valentine's gifts written by Rabbi Debbie Young-Summers. In the article, she mentioned what it would be like if non-Jews or Christians began to celebrate Hanukkah or Pesach. Interestingly, this actually already happens, as it states clearly in the Bible that you should celebrate Passover. And the Jehovah's Witnesses, who take the Bible literally, already do celebrate Passover as the Bible instructs. I have always found it strange that other Christian sects do not also celebrate Passover. After all, not only does it say clearly in the Bible that you should celebrate Passover, but the Passover meal was also Jesus' Last Supper. So it just seemed, this arrived about a week after Jon and I had started chatting about today, and it seemed too good to ignore. Of course, you know, one can argue that, yes, these things are biblically mandated, but so are a lot of other things that I don't see a lot of Christians keeping. Maybe the Jehovah's Witnesses are, but I'm not convinced. And of course, these are all commentaries on how we read. Paul very clearly asks the Christian community to make a break from that way of being. And that's absolutely fine. I have absolutely no struggle with Christians proudly declaring Christian theology and being proud, witnessing Christians. But there is the Lord's Supper, there is Maundy Thursday, although a friend invited me to a Maundy Thursday service once and said, you're going to recognize loads of it from Passover, and I didn't recognize a thing. But it was a beautiful service, and I love to celebrate, you know, to understand what it is that we do, and to really experience holy envy and see what each other gets up to. But to take one's practice and try to impose theology into it, given the Easter pogroms and other painful parts of our history, really does leave a bad taste in the mouth of most Jews, and doesn't, I feel, further any understanding or dialogue. It just serves to kind of establish supersessionist ideas, and to reassert the kind of ignorance, really, of the beautiful divergent paths that Judaism and Christianity have taken in multiple directions for each of them. And that's what I would love us to be celebrating in dialogue. Let's understand each other, and not try to be each other, and therefore think that we are healing rifts through sharing rituals in that way.
Thank you, Debbie. Thank you so much for that. And thank you to Jon as well. A huge thank you both to Debbie and to Jon for really rich and clear and helpful and challenging presentations. Thank you so much for giving your time to this and for leading us through this issue and for responding so fully to the questions. It's been really fantastic. So thank you very much. And thank you to the audience all for being here and for asking your questions. I hope you enjoyed it and learned something from it. So, whether you want to use the electronic hand clap symbol or unmute and clap, let's say the slightly odd Zoom thank you to our presenters. So thank you.